Thank you. Before we begin, I just want to explain, I had we're going to talk a bit about our encounter with the land of Israel. I had an intimate encounter with the land of Israel the day before I got on my plane last week, where I was riding my bike on a dirt road after the rains, and there was a rut in the dirt path, which I didn't see, but my bike saw. So my bike stopped, and I didn't, and I broke my shoulder. So that's why I'm gonna I can take this off while we chat, but just don't. Nobody's allowed to come up and give me a really strong clap on the shoulder afterwards. In any case, thank you very much. I want to thank Ada, and I want to thank Sharon and then all of you for helping to chat this morning, and of course for your very kind invitation to join you. And thank you all for coming on a midday on a Sunday, where I'm sure between family obligations and other possible pursuits, you made a choice to come here to talk about my Israel trail, which I hope that you'll feel by the end of our conversation is also our Israel trail. Because we're an informal group, I'm going to go one step further. It is a Sunday after all. No, I'm fine, thank you. So I want to start by asking you to imagine the following. I'm standing on a cliff, on a path which is about this wide, and I have a 50-pound pack on my back. And I'm walking on the path, and I get to the kind of an edge of it, and there's a fall of about 40 feet down below, and the cliff's on my left, and the path stops. So I'm on the edge of a cliff. I can't turn this way because my pack is going to pull me down off the cliff. I can't turn this way because the pack just bangs up against the cliffside. I really don't know what to do, so I panic. Thankfully, I had read a book by Thomas Crum called 3 Deep Breaths. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I highly recommend it. It's a lovely book specifically for this kind of an experience, or actually for any time when you're a little bit tense. I took 3 deep breaths, centered myself, and focused a bit. I very slowly lowered the pack to the ground, turned around, and edged my way back along the path to find where I had missed the trail sign, which had indicated that I should climb up the side of the cliff using some handholds. I went back to my pack, and I pulled it back on gingerly again and turned around, and I noticed something really interesting. As I started to make my way back to where the path went up the side of the cliff, I felt like the pack was lighter, which doesn't make any sense, obviously, and yet something had changed. What had changed to a great extent was my attitude. I knew where the path was. I knew where I was going. I had a sense of direction. And that's perhaps just one of the examples of the lessons that I learned while hiking the Israel Trail, which I want to share with you over the next 45 minutes or so. And afterwards, I'm happy to open up for questions and conversation and discussion if you want me to go into more details or give further examples. We're going to accompany our conversation with some imagery, just to give you a feel. I'm not going to relate to each slide as it goes, but I will at least hope that it'll give you a feel for the experience as well as my descriptions of it. I hiked the Israel Trail, which is a 600-mile long, 1,000-kilometer long trail, as you can see from the point that the tip of Israel and Eilat on the Dead Sea in the south, up winding through to the hills of Jerusalem and on the coastal plains up to the border of Lebanon in the north. It took me about 2 months. I did it all alone. And when I say all alone, I mean alone. There were 2 days out of the 48 days of hiking where I actually walked with other people. There were times when I would meet people on the trail. I mean, this was, it's a trail and a set of trails that many people do. And so there would be people coming towards me, or groups, or day hikers, or even others that were hiking the Israel Trail, all of it, some of whom I would pass, most of whom, because this is really something for the 21-year-old crowd, not the 51-year-old crowd, so they would normally pass me, of course. But I did it alone. In fact, when I came to write my book, looking over my journal, I discovered there were 12 days where I actually hiked from morning till night without seeing a single soul. And we'll come back in a little bit to the business of this aloneness, of being alone, and the time it gave me for reflection. But you can imagine this was something of a, let's call it a feat for a casual hiker, something of a challenge for somebody who hadn't necessarily made hiking, although I'd done day hikes before, and I grew up in California, so I have a little bit of background in backpacking for a day here or 2 days there. But in those 8 weeks, 12 miles a day or so, I had a lot of time for thinking. And what I need to explain before we go on with the discussion and the presentation is that I was out on the trail just a few weeks after finalizing my divorce. And this was a divorce that I hadn't looked for. My wife had made a decision 2 years or so previously that she felt that she wanted her freedom, shall we call it, and it was something that was not my choice, and it literally turned my life upside down. And so for me, getting out there on the trail just weeks after handing her the get was the bill of divorce, was the beginning of what was basically a transformation. Having had my life turned upside down, I was full of anger and resentment and certainly pain. And as somebody said to me weeks into the trail, who I met in the midst of a break, when I was explaining to him what I was doing, and he said to me, nikui rosh, he said in Hebrew, clearing your head. I said, I've just spent the last 3 weeks, 12, 14 hours a day, contemplating what's happening with my life, and what am I going to do, and where am I going, and how could this have happened? And you sum it up in 2 words, clearing your head, well, 3 words, but 2 words in Hebrew. But that's basically what it is. And I was overwhelmed with the challenges that were facing me. Personal challenges, every day, the heat, the different inclines, the loneliness and what have you. But I definitely found it not just transformative, but immensely rewarding. And so I'm going to share with you some anecdotes from the trail itself, and most importantly, or as importantly, the lessons that I learned that helped me heal from the pain of my divorce. You know, that idea of putting down your baggage on that cliffside, it may be the perfect metaphor. And sometimes we reach an impasse. Sometimes we reach a point where we just don't know what to do. We might panic or at least feel confused. And sometimes we just have to put down our baggage. We just have to let go. Let go of whatever it is that we're carrying, the pain, the suffering, the difficulties, the history, and look to see what the next step in our own personal journey is. And this is true for all of us when we're facing hardship. And the truth is, whether it's the loss of a loved one, or losing a job, or something even much more difficult to deal with, which of course we all either have experienced in our own lives, I'm sure you all have your own stories of personal challenges, or we of course know people in our family or friendship circle who have had to face personal challenges. And I take a great amount of strength from people like Elie Wiesel or Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, who took from the horror of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, who took from the suffering, which of course we don't compare suffering, but one cannot compare even the pain of divorce to, of course, other more significant and deeply felt and difficult kinds of hardships. But what Viktor Frankl and others did was to take the suffering from the Shoah and to make it meaningful for them, to find ways to get through it by finding meaning in their lives. And we'll return to that shortly, but I'm going to take a 10-second break from a discussion of my trip to recognize that today is, of course, International Holocaust Recognition Day. Now, for us in the Jewish community, we have our own Yom HaShoah, certainly those of us in Israel. So January 27th is less commemorated here in America and certainly not in Israel and the Jewish community. But I was actually peripherally involved. You didn't mention as you were introducing me, but I worked with Natan Sharansky for many, many years, including when he was Minister for Diaspora Affairs for the Israeli government in the Prime Minister's office. And one of the things that we achieved within the years that we were working on the issue of combating anti-Semitism around the world was helping within the European context, France, Britain, Germany, and others, to actually institute January 27th, the day that Auschwitz was liberated, as an international day of commemoration of the Shoah, which now the UN and the United States Department and most European countries recognize. And so if I'm mentioning here the incredible, of course, hardships that people like Viktor Frankl suffered and the way that they found a way to work through that, I simply wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that today is an important day to at least have that also in our minds as we're going through this discussion. One of the things that Viktor Frankl focuses on is having a goal. And we'll return to that. But for me, my goal in any given day was to get to the night camp of that day. And my goal, of course, in general, was to hike through and finish this trek that I had started. The idea for me was to move beyond the pain that I was experiencing, and to try and experience, well, more suffering and pain by the ascents and descents and the heat and the rain and the cold at night, but also to turn that into an experience that would enable me to learn enough to be able to move on. Of course, for me, there was also the element of a discovery and rediscovery of both my own connection to our land and our history and our shared destiny as a people, as well as different kinds of truths and understandings which perhaps I already was aware of, but I needed a little bit of reminder of. You may be familiar with the Ramchal of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who wrote the book Mesilat Yesharim. And he says in his introduction, Mesilat Yesharim, the paths of the just, he says, nothing I'm going to say here is new. I actually think that it's not true. He had a number of different new insights to offer, but his point was sometimes it's worth reviewing that which we already know in order to strengthen ourselves in ways that we might need at the time. And I basically used this opportunity to meditate on mountaintops. And I cried in dry creek beds. And I looked up to the nighttime sky and the stars. And I looked down at the ants and the beetles. And I used the time, especially those first few weeks in the desert, to discover on the trail a sense of self and a sense of identity, a sense of personal and national history. And I want to stop and note that the national history that I'm talking about relates to our connection to the land. The fact that we're hiking not along the Appalachian Trail, not so far from here, or the Pacific Crest Trail, if you're familiar with Cheryl Strayed's book and movie, Wild, or the Pilgrim's Trail in Spain and Portugal, or Trek in South America or the Himalayas. This is the Israel Trail. And one of the most phenomenal experiences that you can have hiking the Israel Trail is walking through, for instance, Midbar Tzin, Nahal Tzin, the desert of Tzin and the river, or the dry riverbed of Tzin, which some of you may recognize from these week's parshas, these week's Torah portions, is actually mentioned as one of the areas where the children of Israel wandered in the desert in the 40 years coming out of Egypt before we came into the land of Israel. Now, for the record, this isn't the same Midbar Tzin, because we're in the Negev, and that was down there in the Sinai, or it's not quite 100% sure where it was. But the fact that the names and the experience were so very similar, I felt I was walking in the footsteps of the children of Israel as they left Egypt. And because I was making my own passage from personal suffering and difficulty to a personal sense of freedom or liberation or redemption, of course that resonated very, very greatly within me. What I want to share with you are 5 fundamental lessons that I learned as I walked through the Israel Trail, which basically helped me to move on with my life. Combining these 5 on a hiking trail helped me immeasurably, because each of these, as you'll see, were lessons that I learned actually from the physical hiking. But a life philosophy based on these 5 elements can lead, I think, and it has done for me, to incredible happiness. So the truth is, that's the second reason I wrote the book. One reason was to share with those who were interested in vicariously walking the land of Israel and meeting the people I met and seeing the sites I met and understanding some of the historical and theological places that I walked through. The other reason was to share these lessons that I learned in the hope that perhaps others facing their own challenges might be able to benefit through the lessons that I learned. So let's get started. I walked the first week from Eilat in the south up through the southern Negev and found myself then at a certain place which I'll describe, if I get to it, to spend my first Shabbat, through the Eilat Mountains and the south of the Negev Desert. And the desert experiences, as I began to refer to, were phenomenal. I want you to imagine for a minute walking for 12 hours. You don't have to imagine with the 50-pound pack on your back. That we can put aside for a minute. 12 hours, step after step, hour after hour, in this kind of complete silence. On the one hand, you could say that this kind of aloneness could be frightening. And at times it was somewhat overwhelming, because I felt irrelevant walking through the desert. In a sense, in most places, there were no trees, there were no birds, there was no sound. But more than that, internally, I had left my job. I hired somebody to run the organization that I had been directing for the previous 7, 8 years. My kids were 23, 26, 29, and on their own. My youngest daughter was at home, but she was out of the army and perfectly capable of taking care of herself. My family didn't need me, my friends didn't need me, my work didn't need me. I was alone. And walking through the desert in those first few weeks, the first lesson I learned was an incredible sense of humility. Not that I was irrelevant, not that I wasn't important, but that the truth is that we all need to learn sometimes how it is, how we feel to be literally on our own. And it gives something of a perspective. Without belittling our pain or our problems, it just makes them more meaningful to a certain extent, or more manageable. And it reduces the intensity of our pain or our suffering. It just makes you feel like, or it made me feel like, that I'm kind of part of something bigger than ourselves. And I want us to understand how much we just read the weeks before Parsha of Moses being chosen to lead the children out of Israel. Moses is the paradigm of the leader of the Jewish people for all the ages. What is the one characteristic that our tradition says that Moses was chosen for? Certainly not for his ability to make public speeches. We know that's written in the text itself. But our tradition, our sages say that it was because of his humility, because of his modesty. I'm not for a second comparing myself to Moses. I'm just noting that this is something that we recognize. And let's think for a second of others. For instance, we just celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday. George Washington and the stories of him telling the truth. And he also had a great sense of modesty. Gandhi, Mother Teresa. There are numerous leaders that we can see within Jewish tradition and beyond, where the sense of modesty and humility is one that we definitely connect with. A certain type of moral character and charisma and ability not just to lead, but to be conciliatory, if we look at Gandhi or others that are models. From humility developed in me another very interesting lesson that I learned from the trail. I was, in one of the first days, climbing up Mount Shlomo, Har Shlomo, in these Eilat Mountains. And climbing up, the red guide, which is the official, semi-official, informal guide for all of us who hike the trail, suggested if you had the extra time, go off on this tangent and hike up to the top of Mount Shlomo, Mount Solomon's, because the view from there is breathtaking. I looked at my watch, it was 3 o'clock, darkness isn't until 5, sure, let's do this. I found myself 30 minutes later climbing hand over hand. I can't demonstrate too much with my right shoulder, but literally over boulders as big as I am. Did I mention that I had a 50-pound pack on my back? I felt like Frodo climbing out Mount Mordor, except I didn't have a Sam to carry my pack for me. And at one point, I basically leaned up against a rock, and I thought to myself, Ari, take out your phone, hopefully there'll be reception, call your son, and have him call out the 669, the IDF rescue, search and rescue unit. Let them send a helicopter, get me off the side of this mountain. What am I doing here? I didn't sign up for a challenge, right? I wanted to go clear my head, as this fellow said a few weeks later. If I had known the Hebrew word, I'm fluent in Hebrew, but of course we all have our specialties in terms of a vocabulary which we're familiar with. Hiking was not my specialty. So when I read in the guide about going up this tangential path, my eyes skipped over the word tlula, which in Hebrew, for those of you who don't know, means exceedingly steep. So I found myself on the side of this mountain, and I basically put the idea of calling out the 669, the search and rescue unit, aside. And I said to myself, Aryeh, this is where you are. You're on the side of a mountain. Ain't nobody gonna come get you off here. If you made a mistake in terms of taking this tangent, you're bad. You're gonna have to deal with this. And that was the second lesson that I learned on the trail, acceptance. The importance of our recognizing where we are, the reality of our situation, and then taking steps to deal with it. I've included some of these videos, as you can see, just to accompany us, to give you again another feel for what the hike was like. This is not specifically the place where I was just describing, but the issue here is that the acceptance that I'm talking about, it allows us to focus on what we need to do, to enjoy the experience even to a certain extent, even if we made a bad decision, to accept it, and accepting that you can't change it almost gives us a certain freedom to then move on and to make a better decision, as it were. One of the aspects of the hike for me and that acceptance was being able, as I got to my tent that night, to extract from that specific experience to learn another lesson. In my tent that night, I wrote in my journal, what I learned today on the side of that cliff, of accepting the reality of where we find ourselves, so important for me in terms of accepting the fact that I was now divorced. I was one of those people who never expected to find themselves divorced. And I have to share with you that my marriage, 28 years of marriage with a wonderful British woman who I had met years previously, in England actually. It's okay.